Hello and welcome to the BGCSE History series. It is a series within which we attempt to unpack the history syllabus objectives across the various core topics in the said syllabus. In our installment today, our focus shall be on the topic, the British takeover of the Cape in 1806. It is quite a popular topic. It is quite an interesting topic, I must also add. In terms of your reference materials, there are three sources which would particularly be helpful in terms of your trying to gain an in-depth understanding of what the British occupation of the Cape in 1806 was all about. These three textbooks are the following. One, History of Southern Africa. It is the third edition, which is authored by Kevin Shillington. The second one would be History of Southern Africa, Paka and Fukani. And finally, you could also make use of a History of Southern Africa. It is a book which is authored by N.E. Davis. If I were to pick any two from the three, I would say I will settle for, or my first pick would be Kevin Shillington's History of Southern Africa, because of the ease with which the issues of interest are discussed. The language used is accessible to learners, in my view, and it also, to some degree, it provides rather some activities which you could actually engage in once you have read through, the chapter. This is basically intended to gauge the extent to which you understand the content. Not too far behind in terms of thoroughness would be Paka and Fukani's History of Southern Africa. It is also a useful read. It provides a lot more details, if you wish, on the same subject. So you could perhaps settle for those two as you endeavor to broaden your understanding of what motivated, the British to colonize the Cape, to take it from the Dutch. How the different, constituents in terms of the citizens, the residents of the Cape, were affected by the various reforms which the British introduced upon taking over the Cape in 1806. Now, let's quickly go through the specific objectives. If you have a copy of the syllabus, you would be aware of the fact that there are general and specific objectives within, the assessment as well as the teaching syllabi. Now, what should be of particular interest to you as a learner should be, the contents of the specific objectives, what it is that you are expected to have, learned in the topic. The first objective, uh, as it should be expected, really seeks to explore the motivations of the British. Why were they keen? Why were they interested in taking over the Cape in 1806? What were their motivations? What were they hoping to get out of it? Now, takeover really should not, be a confusing, phrase. Basically, it is about, the British colonization of the Cape in 1806. So, what were their motivations? Um, Now, as it is the norm in the subject history, you cannot, in all fairness, really attribute historical processes to one factor, to one reason in this particular case. That the British, for example, were motivated to colonize the Cape because they desired, like the Dutch before them, to have a refreshment station. So that could not be the only reason. We admit it was one of the reasons which motivated the British to take over the Cape in 1806. So as you are reading through the literature, as you are sifting through the literature, in as far as your desire is to establish the motives of the British, the reasons behind the takeover, look for the different permutations, look for the different explanations. And like I said, it is several of them. Now let's jump straight into it. And I guess, well, in the interest of time, really, we cannot, you know, uh, explore the different, motivations. And also because of the, time, constraints, we will just highlight, a few of those. So the obligation, the onus is on you as a student to go out there and explore the literature to try to establish, the other, explanations. Now, I touched on this obvious, reason that, the British, like the Dutch, in 1652, wanted to set up a refreshment, station, which would serve various purposes. That if they could turn the Cape into a British refreshment station, then British ships could dock at the Cape, and if they required any maintenance work, they could be fixed at the refreshment station. British sailors who might have fallen sick along the voyage to India, where they had, established a colony, could also get medical attention at, the Cape. And the issue about refreshment should also be understood to mean that which you take for granted, rest, and stocking up on fresh supplies such as water, fresh fruits and vegetables. So the British also wanted to have a place where their sailors could rest, to have a place where their sailors could stock up on fresh supplies before they continued with the journey either to India or back to Britain. So a refreshment station, therefore, was one of the reasons why the British decided to take over the Cape from the Dutch in 1806. It is fairly a straightforward point, or in the context of what the objective actually stipulates, a reason. The next example also, in my view, should be fairly easy to understand. That there was a lot of rivalry, fierce competition, if you wish, between the major, maritime, powers: the British, the Portuguese, the French, the Spaniards, and even the Dutch around this particular period. Now, in the context of the British and the French, what is important to note is, the relations were not as cordial as one would perhaps wish. So the fact of the matter is, the British did not want the Cape to fall into the hands of the French, because the French were their rivals. So the French wanted the same things that the British actually wanted. They also had colonial interests in the Far East. So if, imagine, the Cape was to fall into the hands of the French, it is very likely that the British would not be able, to easily access the amenities that the Cape station or refreshment station would offer. So to really safeguard their interests, they had to turn the Cape into their refreshment station. They had to colonize it in 1806 to stave off, French, competition. And like I said, you would be interested to go deep into the literature to try establish the other motivations besides the two which I've just highlighted. Now, what you must also note is that this is a higher order objective. It requires you to explain the reasons for the British takeover. Why did they take over? And before you venture into trying to explain, the reasons for the takeover, you must first and foremost identify, the reason. In this particular instance, it could be that, they did not want the Cape to fall into the hands of the French, and therefore they had to gain control of it before the French could actually colonize it. And then the why part of it really is basically that the French were their rivals in the eyes of the British. The French were their rivals; they were their competitors. So if you are in business and you have competition, you need to do all in your power to protect your interests. And basically, that is what the British did. So go into the literature, establish the other motivations, the other reasons behind the British takeover. Um, the other objective, which also is screaming for our attention in the assessment syllabus, is about what the British set out to do once they had gained control of the Cape colony, once the Cape was their property. Now, they set out, if we may jump straight into it, to come up with legal and administrative changes, which you could call reforms. Um, Now, perhaps you might be wondering why was it necessary for them to introduce these particular changes? If you read through the literature, back to the matter that I touched on earlier, the reasons why the British took over the Cape. They wanted to turn the Cape into an efficient, colony which, could become prosperous by way of it being able to raise revenue through taxation. So the whole system really had to be, you know, reviewed. It had to be revised to ensure that the British are able to achieve the objectives which they set out to achieve. So they introduced multiple changes. Some of the changes were legal in nature, while others were administrative. So as you read through the literature, it is helpful, therefore, that you are able to draw a line between, to categorize these particular reforms, to say these were the reforms which were administrative, and these were reforms which were legal in nature. And I guess examples shall suffice. But before I venture into the examples, I would also want you to note the following, that as you read through these changes, as you try to understand what changes were introduced, it will also be helpful for you to try wrap your mind around why the reforms were introduced. What were the British, trying to achieve? And further to that, you must also try to assess or to evaluate the impact of these reforms on the different, peoples within the Cape, colony, different populations. It could be Africans, it could be Europeans. So see who, in other words, benefited from the introduction of, these, multiple legal and administrative reforms. Now, I said I'll just hint on the examples. You could say, for example, be interested in the following legal, changes or reforms. Remember, I said we can also call them or refer to them as reforms. You have the Hottentot Ordinance, which was introduced, if I'm not mistaken, in 1809. Ordinance or Hottentot Code. The first, sometimes they refer to it as the first Hottentot Code or Ordinance of 1809. So try to figure out, the motivations. Why was this particular reform introduced? And who was it targeting? Who benefited from the introduction of this particular, piece of law? Who was disadvantaged? You are interested in how the reform affected, the lives of, the folks, the people within, the Cape, colony. And like I said earlier, it is important to try figure out why this particular reform was introduced. Your other example could be the second Hottentot Ordinance, which was also known as, the Pass Ordinance. You could also be interested in looking at the Apprenticeship Act. You could also be interested in looking at, the second course of 1811. You would also be interested in looking at the 50th Ordinance of 1828, and finally the Emancipation Act, or the abolition of slavery at within, the British Empire, which also affected, the folks at the Cape colony. So those are just some of the examples of the legal changes which were introduced by the British. Uh, Quickly, let's just touch on the changes which were administrative. Now, I've always believed that the administrative changes were meant to bring about efficiency within the colonial machinery, that the Cape colony had to be an efficient colony, a colony which perhaps would mirror the way things were done, in Britain. Because the intentions of the British really was to establish a permanent settlement. They had no intention of, handing the Cape colony to anybody in the near or even the distant, future. So here are your examples. Now, I have decided to say there is what is known as the Anglicization policy, which was the anchor, the basis of their administrative, reforms. So within the Anglicization policies, there are specific, pieces of, administrative instruments or pieces of law, if you wish, regulations, if you wish, which were introduced. You could, for example, cite the issue here, the introduction of English as the official language of the Cape, that English now became the official language of government, which would be used in schools, which could also be used in courts and even in government offices. So it's a shift from the use of Afrikaans to the use of the English language. So you are anglicizing the Cape by the use of language. So we must try to also understand the motivations why this particular policy was introduced. How were the different people within the Cape colony affected by the introduction of this particular policy? And how did they even, react to the introduction of this particular policy? You also have the introduction of the new currency. So you're also trying to find out the motivations behind the introduction of the new currency. what situation were the British trying to address? And how did the inhabitants of the Cape react? And remember, you must specify, the folks that you are talking about. In this particular instance, you should be interested in the reactions of the Dutch. A new currency is introduced. Were they receptive to the introduction of a new currency, in place of their old currency? So these are things that you ought to be interested in. And then you also have the land, reform or the land policy of the British, that they introduced a new system of land tenure, which was very different to that which the Boers were used, to. And finally, in the specific objectives, the interesting objective that you need to focus on would be the objective which tries to assess the impact um, of these changes, the changes introduced by the British at the Cape, on the not the indigenous but the inhabitants of the Cape. Here you are talking about the Kwekwe and the San, as well as the Dutch settlers or the Europeans. You could use that blanket statement. But sometimes it is helpful to say, how were the Dutch affected? How did they react to the reforms which were introduced by the British? Were the European settlers of Dutch origin happy with the reforms which the British introduced or not? If they were not happy, what were their qualms? What were they not happy about? So, as a student of history, remember, you are interested in more than just trying to find out what happened, but also in the how it happened and why it happened. I guess we will stop here, and in the successive, installments, we shall take each objective and try to, discuss it in greater detail, so that your understanding, of the topic, you know, is as smooth as it should be. And like I said, this is a popular topic with examiners. And if it is popular with the examiners, it also needs to be popular with the learner. And remember, in history, there are no alternative facts. Enjoy your day. Bye bye.